But what Connolly found was we were starting to miss out on what about living with the people who really need to be lived with? What about being with the people themselves? Didn't Pope Leo mention this recently, that he said one of the greatest mistakes we can make in the Christian life is to see Christ as an example instead of what he truly is, which is giving his person to us. And that's quite literally what Blue does.
Welcome, everybody, to the Literary Catholic. I'm Bill Baker. The purpose of this program, I think you know by now, if you've been a follower of it, is really to share the nuances of our faith through the words of some of the most creative people who've written in the English language in modern times. And we talk with scholars about some of the books that we then read and comment on and see how they reflect our faith, what insights we get, and how it enriches this world that we live in. Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Stephen Mirarchi, an associate professor at Benedictine College, and his research specialty is Catholic fiction. He's the editor of the works of Myles Connolly from Cluny Classics and author of scholarly introductions to several Catholic books, including Mr. Blue, that we're going to be reading today and talking about today, and The Great Gatsby by Ignatius Press. He's published extensively in journals, including a St. Austin Review and the Christianity and Literature. Welcome, Dr. Mirarchi. Thank you for being with us, and you're really an expert on this, and I'm kind of humbled by having you here to talk about it. So, Mr. Blue, I had actually never heard of, and I read it and was really quite blown away. I really have to say I liked it. Maybe it's because it was also so short. The other, though, is that Connolly, when you look him up, he was a film writer, and he's had quite an interesting background. He's no longer with us, but would you fill us in on who he was and what his specialties were and how he wound up, in your opinion and knowledge, writing this book?
Yeah, so Myles Connolly, people generally know of him for one of two reasons. One is because they have heard of Mr. Blue, because it turned out to be one of the best-selling books in 1950s America, and we can go back to that at some point if we want to. But the other reason they might have heard of him is because he worked so much with Frank Capra. And just about everyone who has grown up Catholic has at some point either heard, referenced, or seen It's a Wonderful Life or some other Frank Capra movie. And it turns out that Frank Capra and Myles Connolly were longtime friends. They sometimes didn't agree with each other rather strenuously, but Frank Capra ended up going to Myles Connolly's funeral. He ended up making a statement before a congressional board about Myles Connolly. There's all kinds of backstory there, but the important thing is that Frank Capra said that Myles Connolly helped him in some way or the other with just about everything he ever did. So he worked most of his career in Hollywood as a faithful Catholic who went to daily mass. Can you imagine working in Hollywood all that time?
Really, no.
As someone with that strong of a faith? But as we know from people who've talked about him, he was no nonsense in that way. And he had graduated salutatorian from Boston College, and people there said you could not win an argument with this man. He knew his stuff backwards and forwards, whether it was philosophy, theology, or architecture, which he was planning on becoming an architect. But he got pulled into the journalism world and was a journalist for a while. And it was only when he got the opportunity to go out and start writing and producing for Hollywood that he took that way. But Mr. Blue was originally written in 1928, and Gatsby had been published 3 years before. And the Jesuit John Breslin wrote an article saying that John Breslin thought that Mr. Blue was a response to The Great Gatsby. It was a response from one literary Catholic to another. And in his article, he says, here, I've seen these, there's just too much that lines up. So I took that and kind of ran with it and found a lot more examples, and I put those in the annotations in the annotated edition of Mr. Blue. And it turns out that, again, my opinion is that Myles Connolly thought, well, Fitzgerald, you've given us a diagnosis. I don't necessarily agree with that diagnosis, and I want to show a different path forward. I actually want to give us a solution.
Well, I think maybe he has, and then we could talk a little bit later on, because somebody also wrote that really since this book was written, there has been no even more modern, this is 1928, I guess, 1920, and there's really been no more recent analysis of the issue of the Catholic faith fitting into the bigger society than this one. And this one does a pretty good job, even in contemporary times. Talking about a world that we live in, particularly a country that we live in, that is driven by my money, by greed, by more, and this is a book about a man who is the exact opposite of that. You want to talk about how Mr. Blue reflects being a Christ-like figure, I suppose.
Well, yeah, very much. So it's not that he never had those things, which is interesting, because Connolly shows him at the beginning of the novel coming into an inheritance of a significant amount of money.
Right. He became rich, but very quickly.
Yes.
And then got poor in a hurry because he didn't want the money, in effect.
But very quickly, yes, being a good St. Francis of Assisi figure, he says, I know the way to happiness, and the way is getting rid of it all. Yeah. So he does, and lives in a packing crate on the top of an apartment building. Okay, so he literally becomes one of the poorest of the poor by choice, because he knows that somehow that's the key to his vocation. And he talks about his prayer life with Lady Poverty, which of course is a direct reference to St. Francis of Assisi. And throughout the book, you get these references to the evangelical councils, what we used to call them. I think we still call them that. I hope we do. I just don't hear the phrase very often. But the vows of poverty, chastity, simplicity of life, well, that's poverty, simplicity, and obedience. And he takes them in a way that, again, you almost need a book to show what would it look like if a layman living in 1920s America took the vows, but he took them in an extraordinary way directly from his intercession through Lady Poverty to God himself. What would that look like? And to his credit, Connolly says it would actually probably be a little bit confusing for a while. Yeah. And there's a section of the book where we see Blue struggling with some of his spirituality. We do see those genuine struggles, which again makes it something more than a plaster saint novel. It shows the real difficulties that come with navigating the spiritual life. But he does. He ultimately takes all of those vows and through them finds the way to give himself to the people who need it most, the poorest of the poor in Boston. And, when it was written in 28, this was not, the church in America was very much emphasizing I think we now call the manualist tradition, which is, here's a question, here's an answer. Here's a question, here's an answer. Here's the way things are laid out. And there's nothing wrong with emphasizing that when there is a need for that. But what Connolly found was we were starting to miss out on what about living with the people who really need to be lived with? What about being with the people themselves? In other words, and I think it was, I think, didn't Pope Leo mention this recently, that he said one of the greatest mistakes we can make in the Christian life is to see Christ as an example instead of what he truly is, which is giving his person to us. And that's quite literally what Blue does. He goes and gives his person to the poorest of the poor in Boston and lives with them. And that's how he ascends, as it were, in spiritual life, by descending. Right.
This is a book that has a lot of very powerful either quotations or it has some letters in it written by that is read by the narrator, whom we don't really exactly know who it is.
That's right.
And the narrator who narrates this story of Blue's life, in effect, adult life, changes over time. The narrator has something to do with what really happens ultimately. Do you want to comment on that and what that means?
Yeah, that's very important in particular because I think it can be argued, well, I don't even think it needs to be argued, but I think the standard position of The Great Gatsby is that Nick is telling the story having maybe changed a little bit, having witnessed Gatsby, but maybe not. Whereas the narrator in Mr. Blue certainly goes from someone who is not quite sure where his faith fits in with his wanting to become a successful businessman to, by the end of the novel, his misdirected skepticism becomes properly directed. In other words, his misdirect, there's a place for skepticism. C.S. Lewis is very good on this point. Says there is a good place for that. However, it has to be properly directed. And the narrator's skepticism is directed at first towards, I don't know how faith fits in with the world. But by the end, he has directed it towards, no, you can't tell me that somebody like Blue is dead. You can't tell me that that has happened. In other words, he begins to realize that I'm going to have to write his story, which is not a very St. Francis of Assisi thing to do. Now, St. Francis of Assisi preferred to be with rather than I quote at one point where he talks about his suspicion of writing as a substitute for being with. But the narrator realizes, yes, I have to write his story. I'm not going to let him die, as it were. But he also knows that he believes in the resurrection now, fully and truly.
Mr. Blue and the narrator are interesting together. The narrator, I'd say at the very beginning of this, starts treating Mr. Blue, and I'm trying also not to give too much of the book away because the book is, whenever read it, and it's an easy read because one of my favorite things is it's short.
It is.
Is that in the reading of this book, the narrator starts with thinking or describing Blue as who is this guy who winds up living on top of a big, huge, multi-story skyscraper in New York on the roof in a tent, and it starts really describing him as mentally ill, in effect. That this guy is a strange weirdo, and observing him that way, and then as this thing progresses, he realizes that Blue is really a man of a deeply profound and deep faith, and also a man who lives that faith. Do you want to comment on any of the things I just said, or what?
Yeah, it's quite interesting how the narrator's view changes as he gets to know Blue and is frustrated by Blue. And again, that's part of the honesty of the story, and again, why this is something more than. Well, before I say that, I want to say one of the things that Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby was very frustrated by in the literature that he was reading, and we know this from his letters, he was very frustrated that everything the press, and especially the Catholic press, seemed to like in his time about Catholic stories were Catholic stories that were very pious.
Yeah.
And Fitzgerald said, I'm going to write a story that has a Catholic element, and he used those words, but it's not going to be pious. Now, some other decisions were made along the way, and whether he succeeded at that or not is a different question. But that's exactly what Connolly also wanted to make sure he didn't do. This is not a story that has piety at the forefront. This is a story that has a question of, when I'm encountered with a real example of the faith, I might be frustrated. I might have questions. And Connolly says, good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those questions. And that's exactly what he and the narrator do throughout the novel. And they have a very funny moment when they're at the old Oyster House in downtown Boston, which of course is the oldest restaurants in existence, with its history going way back. And when Mr. Blue sees how voraciously the narrator eats, he says, you understand what it means to give everything away. You understand what it means. You are the most sincere and virtuous glutton I've ever seen. And it's one of those lines that catches you by surprise, because you go, wait a minute. It's very Chestertonian, by the way. We can talk about Chester in a second. but it's this very Catholic way of seeing the good, even in something that you may not be willing to see the good in first. And Blue says, no, you do understand what it means to abandon everything. You've just misdirected it. You're giving away everything in terms of food. That's not the way. Yeah, okay, keep that. Keep that giving away everything, then turn it to God instead, and then you've got it. And it's one of those moments where, again, the narrator's frustrated at first, and they think, well, maybe this guy's right.
Well, the comments you made earlier about Lewis and Connolly about piety are very interesting, because when I was first asked to host this podcast, a literary Catholic, I thought, here we go. This is going to be like the Hallmark Channel. You know, we're going to all these little sweet pious things. We're not doing that well, and I want to thank our producer, especially Mary Jane Wood, for we're at a notch above piety. We're at a notch, a truly intellectual and deeply spiritual notch, where we put piety aside and talk about the real world and the life, in a sense, the life that Christ reflected into the real world that he lived in. There are a couple of quotes in this book that just kind of I'm going to steal for other purposes, but for the purposes of this interview, I think I should mention them. One is that it comes up toward the end of the book that Blue wanted some inscription on his tombstone. And the inscription that he suggested, which I think is really something, is, never was there a worse sinner, and never was God kinder to one. And that was pretty special. And then there is another quote that I really liked, and it's a quote of a quote, and it's a quote from the curate of Ars, who is St. John Vianney. And the quote is, "The cross is the gift God gives his friends." Wow. The cross is the gift that God gives his friends. A lot about suffering and what this life is about. And so many, of course, ask that ultimate question: why is it so hard? Why am I, I just finished a movie myself where we're doing a film about kind of the meaning of life called Wisdom Keepers on public television, kind of some of the profound theologians in America of all faiths. And this is a question that comes up over and over again. Why is there so much suffering? But you also think about the Eastern religions, Buddhism, for example. I mean, that's really a major tenet of the religion, that, hey, that's what we're here to suffer. That's the bottom line. Anything that you want to comment on that? Does that take you anywhere?
So the quote from the Curate of Ars, from St. John Vianney, that comes from his little talk or sermon or speech called The Catechism on Suffering. And that whole thing is worth reading in and of itself. First of all, because the Curate of Ars could write so concisely and so richly at the same time. But yes, the problem of suffering is something that Catholic literature, I would say, has been in a great position to reflect on.
Yeah.
Generally, people, when it comes to that particular topic, people think of, for example, Graham Greene. Power and the Glory is a great example of that.
Yes.
Brideshead by Evelyn Waugh. These are great books. And then, of course,
we've read them. By the way, we've read them on those.
Good. That's great.
They are great.
Yeah,
I agree.
They are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just about any Flannery O'Connor story will show you some type of suffering, one way or the other, and God's often counterintuitive ways of intervening in that way. For Connolly, there's the question of suffering becomes one of, does Christianity have an answer? Maybe not a mathematical equation answer, but an answer in the person of Christ that the crucifixion is the key to. And this is what St. John Vianney was getting at, is that the crucifixion and the resurrection always go together. You can't really have one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
And the path to one, unfortunately, because of the way the world is, the way that is the secret. That is the narrow gate, right? The narrow gate is the cross through which we have to go. And that is what Mr. Blue realizes, is that, well, okay, if I embrace this and realize that it can be redemptive, not just for me, but for others. If I realize I can participate in the redemption of his suffering, his passion, and his resurrection, then that brings a meaning to suffering that is beyond anything I could have imagined myself.
Mm-hmm.
And moves. And so that's where Connolly is going with this, and hoping to say, hey, look, Catholicism in particular offers something here that is very mysterious, and not mysterious as in we can never know it, but mystery in the sense that the physicist Stephen Barr talks about it in his book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith. He talks about mystery from the Greek mysterion as being that which is so far on the horizon we can glimpse it, but we can never fully know it, but we keep traveling towards it. Yeah, and in other words, it's inexhaustible. Not that we'll never know it. And he talks about that in the sense of recovering the sense of what a good mystery is. And that's where Connolly is going here. That's what Connolly wants to do. One thing I would say, maybe to qualify me my earlier comments about piety a little bit, is simply that piety is, of course, very important in the Christian life and the Catholic life, but the only problem comes when piety substitutes for aesthetics. That's where I would say the problem is if you're using piety as a substitute for the skill craft of writing and the great aesthetics that come with writing, then that's the problem. There's no problem if aesthetics and piety can work together in a work of art. Absolutely, there's no problem there. But the problem, of course, is when the aesthetics have been either left out, hollowed out, forgotten, and piety, again, is the only thing you have, then, okay, works of piety are great for their intended purpose. But for people like Fitzgerald and Connolly, and certainly Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, they wanted to emphasize the aesthetics that necessarily weren't of a pietistic, and I would distinguish piety from pietistic, or pietism in that sense.
Mm-hmm. If this is not a nice question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because you're such an expert on all these things. Of the two, Fitzgerald, Connolly, who do you think was the better of the two writers, the deeper of the two?
Oh, wow.
Is that too big of a question?
No, it's not, because my current opinion is that I do believe Fitzgerald had the edge in aesthetics, but I believe Connolly had the edge in the spiritual life.
It's something I agree with. And
so I like reading them together in that sense. Mm-hmm. And remember, Connolly was just at the beginning of his creative art when he wrote Mr. Blue. He ended up writing 4 more books over the next 25 years. And I do think that Connolly reached an aesthetic level that would be on par with somebody like with Fitzgerald a little bit later, but it took him more time to get there. But I mean, the guy was writing award-winning movies and producing them in Hollywood, so he was by no means an aesthetic slack, no way. But yeah, the things that Fitzgerald does aesthetically in Gatsby are just dazzling. But the things that Connolly does through some very good aesthetics is he brings out a vision of the spiritual life and the challenges and the rewards of the spiritual life that I think Fitzgerald just either wasn't ready for or just plainly wasn't interested in that sense.
By the way, this is a sidebar and a distraction, and nothing to do with what we're talking about, except I'm speaking to you from Connecticut. You're in Kansas. But here in Connecticut, according to a couple scholars that I know, that Fitzgerald this is really where they claim he wrote his book. And they can show me houses and everything, that even though supposedly it takes place on Long Island, it really takes place here. And not far from where this university is, which I thought was kind of interesting. And they took
the neighborhood. I think one of the things we know for sure is that he did spend at least 2 months, I think it was either 2 or 3 months, renting a house on Long Island that is the basis. But he made it, I think it was only 2 or 3 months is what we have the evidence of. So.
Back to our subject, Mr. Blue, and the power of listening to that, reading it. There's many deep, profound things said. And one thing got me that I think is worth thinking about. Everything is worth thinking about. And he said on page 34, without Christ, this is Mr. Blue speaking, without Christ, we'd be little more than bacteria breeding on a pebble. That's pretty interesting, don't you think? And probably true.
And what Connolly is having Blue reflecting there on is the rising level of, again, not science, but scientism. The rising idea that science explains everything, including the creation, the chance, and again, this was exploding in academic circles thanks to things like the rise of not Darwinism proper, but what some people were beginning to figure as social Darwinism. And you see this reflected in some of the earlier literature, like American naturalism. People like Jack London and Stephen Crane were wrestling with these ideas and showing the kind of very dramatic stories that could be built around naturalistic ideas. And that's part of what Connolly is reflecting there. He's reflecting that rise of that scientific mindset that says science and empiricism can explain everything. We don't need God anymore. And that's where
he says, yes, we do. No fooling, we really do. There's another section of this book that talks about in effect, the end of Christianity. He had either it was a dream or some kind of
the movie.
Where all of a sudden, I went to a movie, I guess, where there was this world that was entirely different 1,000 years from now, and he finally found the last Christian and got rid of him, and there was a big celebration. Where was he going with that, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's quite literally the center of the book. Okay, so it is right. That is, you want to talk what's central to the book. You know what happens in the center there. What happens is the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Is what happens.
Okay, I didn't.
It's very interesting from a literature and a literary historical point of view. That is one of the first extended dystopias we get in American literature. There had been a few others, but this is one of the first that took an entire dystopian vision in a chapter. Wow. And said, look, here's what a future would look like without Christianity. And so, and then this is Blue's movie vision. Blue wants to make a moving picture about this. And he's telling the narrator. And aside from Yevgeny Zamyatin's dystopian novel, it would be another 15, 20 years before we got something like Aldous Huxley or George Orwell writing entirely fleshed out dystopias. But Connolly's doing it at this point. And he says, what would it look like if we got rid of all the Christians? Right. And because we don't need them anymore, right? We don't need God anymore. Well, these people are an obstacle, right? And that's what, but of course, Connolly says, no, you can't get rid of Christianity no matter how hard you try. And it turns out there is that secret priest, and he has to, as you learn, grow his own wheat and get his own grapes too. And then when he does the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And Connolly, man, when I first read this book, an interesting point, I had never heard of this book either until I started teaching here at Benedictine, and one of my students said to me, have you read this book, Mr. Blue? I just don't know what to think of this book. I mean, I like it, but there's this other. And I said, I have not heard of it. And like you, I read it and said, whoa, there's a lot going on here. Why haven't I not heard this book? So I'm so thankful to that student for mentioning it. But that's what happens there is he says that this priest brings about the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And I remember reading that for the first time and thinking, wow, he mentions the alb, the stole, the chasuble. And of course, this is 1920s. Of course, it's now what we call the extraordinary form of the Mass. But at that time, it was the Mass. The priest has the maniple. Okay, so everything proper. And so Connolly knew all these terms, and he knew how they all functioned. Going, man, it's impressive. This is not education on these things was not necessarily something you could easily find in all parts. So he knew his stuff down to the names of the vestments and what purpose they served, everything else.
He clearly understood the Catholic faith in the formal sense, but in the most deep and profound sense, which is, of course, the most important part of it.
Wow.
I wonder why. I mean, this man's a significant, brilliant writer. Wonder why his writing of this scale wasn't reflected in all these movies he wrote, which were really kind of, I'd say, I don't want to say it in a bad way, but I'd say kind of commercial movies. I'm sure they were fine, but that none of them were considered great, I don't think. Maybe
Yeah, besides It's a Wonderful Life and maybe Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
those two, maybe. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
And
and
30
maybe a few
movies,
others.
so
But
why? I wonder why, because
no,
obviously he runs very, very deep.
he does.
Mhm.
It's interesting because he's sometimes uncredited with the help that he gave. We have to, in some sense, surmise where did he give help and where did he. But you remember that scene in It's a Wonderful Life when uh, then Jimmy is praying. He's making the prayer that's probably somewhat ridiculous, right? He's like, God, and then the guy in the bar comes up and punches him out, right? That's for what you did to my wife. And that is about as Myles Connolly as it gets,
Really?
which is, if you've been you're living your life and not in accord with the gospel and you pray, God's going to tell you one way or the other, hey, you want to get back on track, this and this need to change. that's generally the way these things work. And so you could I think what Connolly did was he definitely was interested in entertaining people. And we know from interviews that he had that he said, I'm definitely interested in entertaining people with a good sense of humor, because I do believe with G.K. Chesterton that humor is of God, good humor, and lightening of the spirit is of God. And he said, but I want to do a third thing too, and that is tell them some kind of essential truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he's talking capital T truth. He's not talking, the contradiction, my truth. He's talking, no, I'm talking the truth. So we know he wanted to do those things. And that's what he was going for.
Dr. Mirarchi, I don't want to end without you saying what you need and want to say. I'm sure I missed some key things you would like to mention before we pull the cord on this podcast. Is there anything that we missed that we should be talking about and that you'd like to share with our listeners and viewers?
Sure. I think the only thing I would maybe want to highlight, because I think it's so interesting about Mr. Blue in particular, is when it was first published in 1928, it went either unnoticed or highly criticized.
Mm-hmm.
Now people said, well, this is ridiculous. Well, people don't do this. People don't look like this.
Yeah.
Well,
He
didn't even get in your hometown.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And even from Catholic publications, they didn't like it.
Yeah.
And now they also didn't like Gatsby. So this is also an interesting question. So the question, of course, is why by 1954 were 500,000 copies of Mr. Blue in print.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and when the publisher asked Myles Connolly to write the silver anniversary introduction, 25 years on, 1953, why, what, and that's exactly what Myles Connolly struggled with. He says, I really don't know why this book got popular all of a sudden. I don't know. And he said, but I'm going to chalk it up to God's providence and the way that God wants his message to come at certain times in certain places. And of course, we know that's one of the great teachings about private revelations, that God often sends private revelations to help correct an emphasis or an overemphasis or an underemphasis. So divine mercy comes at a time when people are heavily focused on guilt or what have you. But a lot of scholars, and I tend to agree with them, because let me just mention one other thing along this line that'll be of interest, tend to think that the rise of Peter Morin and Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement, where all of a sudden Dorothy Day says, okay, I've converted. I want to live among the poorest of the poor in New York City, and that is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And Peter Morin says, yes, let's do it. And then all of a sudden, we have living examples of very flawed people by their own admission, right? Dorothy Day had an abortion, but she repented of it and says, I'm going to be doing penance for the rest of my life. But I'm going to live among the poorest of the poor and do it right there in New York City. And they did it. Okay, so people start saying, well, didn't somebody write a book about this, 10 or 15 years ago? And those two things rise at the same time. And you see a lot of people saying, oh, Catholic worker movement, that's like Mr. Blue. And boom. Yeah. Okay, so with the rise of the Catholic worker movement and this rediscovery or re-emphasis on the idea of being with the people that need it the most and being among them, being literally Christ's witness to them, for example, a priest in the person of Christ. You could do this. And that's one of the reasons why the book becomes so popular in the 1950s. And with that, now, only recently did I learn, because I heard from someone who is a Catholic worker, and he's been doing some research into Peter Maurin, and he's been looking through Peter Maurin's documents, and he's gotten permission to do this. And he emailed me, he said, I'm really excited. I found something I want you to know about. I have found a letter from Peter Maurin to Myles Connolly, where Peter Maurin wrote him and said, we're doing this. You know, I've read Mr. Blue. I think seems like you're on board. Basically, if you wrote this book, it's like, how would you like to help us with our journalism? Because you're a very famous journalist. Yeah, as it turns out, Myles Connolly had worked for many years as the editor of Columbia, the Knights of Columbus magazine. And he did such a good job with it, he got the magazine banned from Mexico in the 1920s because Myles Connolly was one of the people to saying, hey, priests are being shot in the streets down there, Miguel Pro, etc. Like this has to stop. So of course, so that's how good a job he did with it. Now, sadly, we don't have Myles Connolly's response to Peter Maurin, or at least nobody's found it yet. But we know for sure now that the Catholic work movement was aware of Mr. Blue. They had read it, and that there's an evidentiary connection there. I mean, we had surmised it for years. We thought this makes sense, but now we know for sure that something was going on.
Well, you say that too, that Mr. Blue was written in the 20s, and then it disappeared, and then it came back with full vengeance in the 50s. So the real question next is, what is next? Is there an, I mean, you know, it seems like it's time for, obviously we don't have Connolly to write, but is there something that is percolating that you're aware of that brings us up to the 21st century in this world and this country that we live in as Catholics?
I think so. There have been a number of people over the past 10 years who've been saying if we're not already starting a new Catholic literary revival, that we're on the edge or the cusp of one. So Wise Blood Books with Josh Wren has been doing very well. They've been publishing a number of interesting types of things. There are a couple of other independent presses, Angelico Press, for instance. They've been publishing some very good things. And there have been a lot of other smaller presses that are starting to do this. There was an announcement recently that Bishop Barron's Word on Fire is actually soliciting for original works of fiction now. That was a big move for a big press like that to say we're accepting submissions of fiction. Okay, they're going to get flooded, I'm sure, and that's good. So I think the material is out there. I think for a long time we may not have had the resources to get it out in a way that could reach the intended audience. That I'm not sure of, but it is happening. And there are some outlets that are doing it. We also have many good journals. So Dapple Things was a great journal that has been helping to get those things out. St. Austin Review, which I've done some things for. Yeah, there are plenty that are working. So I do think we at least have the capabilities.
Well, Dr. Mirarchi, we're counting on you. If you see something, I'm serious. If you see something we should read here on Literary Catholic, we're going to want two things from you. First, we're going to want to know what it is. And then the second is we're going to want you to come on and talk to us again about
I'd be happy to.
What it is saying. Well, we'd be very happy to have you. And but the only thing I ask is, because I have to read these and I'm making movies on the side, don't make it too long. I don't, no proofs or anything of that nature. Let's keep it under a couple 100 pages. So
you got it.
Okay. Thank you. We're really honored to have you with us.
It was my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Please keep up the good work, and we hope to see you very soon.
I'd love that. Thank you.